James Joyce, 1882 to 1941, stands as one of the most influential and groundbreaking figures in modern literature. His works revolutionized the way fiction was written and read, pushing the boundaries of narrative form, language, and structure. Joyce's contribution to literature, particularly through his novels Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, has earned him a place in the pantheon of literary giants. His exploration of stream of consciousness writing, the use of fragmented narrative techniques, and his deep engagement with themes of identity, consciousness, and the human condition set him apart as a modernist innovator. Yet, despite his intellectual prominence, Joyce's works remain notoriously challenging, with critics and readers alike continuing to grapple with their complexity. At the core of Joyce's literary significance is his ability to intertwine personal and universal themes. His novels are marked by a deep engagement with the individual's experience of time, memory, and consciousness, often depicting moments of epiphany and revelation. Joyce's early works, such as Dubliners and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, laid the groundwork for his later, more experimental novels. These works revealed his preoccupation with the idea of self-discovery, cultural identity, and the transformative potential of art. While Dubliners offered a series of short stories that exposed the paralysis of Dublin's social landscape, A Portrait introduced readers to Joyce's alter ego, Stephen Dedalus, a figure who would later reappear in Ulysses. Joyce's masterpiece, Ulysses, is often hailed as one of the greatest novels ever written. First published in 1922, the novel is famous for its radical narrative techniques, particularly the use of stream of consciousness and interior monologue. Set over the course of a single day in Dublin, Ulysses follows the lives of three main characters, Leopold Bloom, Stephen Dedalus, and Molly Bloom, as they navigate their personal lives and confront the ordinary and extraordinary events of their day. The novel's allusions to Homer's Odyssey provide a structural framework, but is the complex, multi-layered prose that has earned Ulysses its reputation as a modernist tour de force. Its impact on the evolution of the novel as a form cannot be overstated, as it challenged conventional notions of plot, character, and language. Yet, despite its fame, Joyce's work has been the subject of considerable debate. Critics and scholars have often wrestled with the ambiguity and dense symbolism found in his writing. While some have praised Joyce for his intellectual rigor and his ability to capture the complexities of the human experience, others have critiqued his works for being overly cerebral and inaccessible. Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's final novel, exemplifies these concerns. Written in a highly experimental style, Finnegan's Wake defies easy interpretation with its elliptical language and fragmented narrative structure. However, this very difficulty is part of what makes Joyce's work so enduring. It forces readers to engage with the text on a deeper, more reflective level. Joyce's influence extends far beyond his own era, shaping the course of modernist literature and continuing to resonate with contemporary writers and thinkers. The 20th and 21st centuries saw the rise of a literary tradition heavily indebted to Joyce, with writers such as Virginia Woolf, Samuel Beckett, and William Faulkner incorporating aspects of his narrative experimentation into their own work. Moreover, the study of Joyce's writing has spurred the development of new critical methodologies, particularly in the realms of literary theory, psychoanalysis, and post-structuralism. Joyce's legacy is also marked by his status as an expatriate writer. Having left Ireland for Europe in his early 20s, Joyce spent much of his adult life living in cities like Trieste, Paris, and Zurich. His expatriate status, combined with his complex relationship with his homeland, made him a figure both within and outside of Irish literary tradition. Joyce's portrayal of Dublin in his works was deeply personal, yet he maintained a critical distance from the city that shaped him. In this way, his works function as both an intimate exploration of his personal history and a broader critique of the cultural and social environment of early 20th century Ireland. The Irish context is particularly important in understanding Joyce's literary output, as it forms the backdrop for much of his writing. Joyce's relationship with Ireland was marked by a tension between his desire to escape its provincialism and his recognition of its significance in shaping his identity. His works often reflect this ambivalence, blending a deep love for the country with a sharp critique of its religious and political institutions. Ulysses, for example, is both a celebration of Irish culture and a critique of its limitations. Joyce's characters navigate the landscape of Dublin, encountering the complexities of national identity, religious orthodoxy, and colonial history. In doing so, Joyce crafts a literary world that is both highly specific and universally resonant. One of the key themes that runs throughout Joyce's work is the notion of epiphany, the moment of sudden clarity or insight that often occurs in his characters' lives. These moments are not always dramatic or life-changing, but they reveal something profound about the human experience. For Joyce, epiphanies are tied to the workings of memory and consciousness, and they often involve a deep awareness of the passage of time and the inevitable tension between past and present. In this way, Joyce's works offer readers a window into the inner workings of the mind, revealing the complexities of human thought and emotion. While Joyce's style and techniques may be challenging for many readers, his works continue to offer rich rewards for those who are willing to engage with them. The complexity of his writing invites multiple readings, and each new encounter with his works opens up new avenues for interpretation. Whether it is the detailed descriptions of Dublin and Ulysses, the intricate wordplay of Finnegan's Wake, or the psychological depth of a portrait of the artist as a young man, Joyce's novels offer a world that is constantly evolving, full of hidden meanings and possibilities. James Augustine Aloysius Joyce was born on February 2nd, 1882, in the heart of Dublin, Ireland, into a family marked by both ambition and instability. His early years were shaped by the complexities of a rapidly changing society, where Irish nationalism was beginning to take root and the Catholic Church held a dominant influence. Joyce's family, though deeply entrenched in Dublin's middle class, was far from affluent, and his father, John Joyce, was prone to financial irresponsibility, which would have a lasting impact on the family's security. Despite these financial difficulties, Joyce was fortunate to receive a formal education, an opportunity that would ultimately shape his future as a writer. Joyce's early childhood was characterized by a duality of influences. His father's freewheeling approach to life was at odds with the stricter, more religious values embodied by his mother, Mary Jane Murray. Joyce's education at various Catholic schools, most notably Clongo's Wood College and later Belvedere College in Dublin, was marked by his sharp intellect and a growing sense of intellectual rebellion. From an early age, Joyce displayed a remarkable aptitude for literature, often excelling in his studies and gaining recognition for his literary talents. However, it was the tensions between his father's lack of discipline and his mother's religious devotion that would become a recurrent theme in his work. The Joyce household was in a constant state of flux, with the family moving from one home to another due to the financial instability caused by John Joyce's erratic career. Joyce's father was a man of great charm, but little financial acumen, often spending more than he earned and leading the family into debt. This instability created a tension between Joyce's intellectual aspirations and the harsh realities of his family's economic condition. The struggles he faced as a child, living in poverty despite his academic promise, were formative experiences that would inform his later works, especially in his exploration of the struggles between aspiration and the limitations imposed by society and family. Despite the financial and emotional turmoil at home, Joyce found solace and inspiration in his education. His time at Belvedere College, a prestigious Catholic institution, was crucial in shaping his intellectual development. It was here that Joyce was exposed to a wide range of classical and literary texts that would ignite his passion for writing. Under the guidance of his teachers, Joyce began to develop a critical perspective on the world around him. The strict religious environment of Belvedere, with its emphasis on Catholic doctrine and moral instruction, contrasted sharply with Joyce's growing skepticism toward religion, an attitude that would permeate much of his later work. His complex relationship with Catholicism, marked by both a deep knowledge of religious texts and a critical distance from their authority, would remain a key theme throughout his life and writing. Joyce's exposure to literature, particularly works by writers such as William Shakespeare, Dante Alighieri, and Charles Dickens, further fueled his desire to become a writer. His time at University College Dublin, where he studied modern languages and literature, proved to be a crucial period in the formation of his literary voice. Here, Joyce immersed himself in the works of European writers and thinkers, and it was during this time that he began to challenge the limitations of the Irish literary tradition. Joyce became increasingly disillusioned with the nationalist rhetoric that pervaded much of Irish literature, which, in his view, often overlooked the complexities of individual experience and the role of the artist in society. In the early years of the 20th century, Dublin was a city caught between tradition and modernity. It was a place where the remnants of British colonial rule were still felt, and where the Catholic Church exerted a powerful influence over both social and political life. At the same time, there was a growing sense of Irish nationalism, with calls for independence from British rule gaining momentum. Joyce, however, found himself distanced from the nationalist movement. His growing intellectual independence led him to reject the narrow, parochial vision of Ireland that he saw in much of the nationalist discourse. He viewed the movement as a form of cultural stagnation, and he often criticized the Catholic Church for its oppressive role in Irish society. The intellectual ferment of Dublin during Joyce's youth would also influence his decision to leave Ireland in search of greater freedom. Joyce's personal and artistic desires were at odds with the conservative, religious environment that dominated his homeland. His departure from Dublin in 1904 marked the beginning of his life as an expatriate, a decision that would define much of his career. Joyce's choice to leave was also motivated by his desire to escape the suffocating influence of the Irish bourgeoisie, as well as his desire to explore the broader cultural and intellectual currents of Europe. The relationship between Joyce and his home country was one of ambivalence. While he often expressed a deep affection for Dublin, his writings reveal a city caught in a state of paralysis, where individuals were trapped by social, religious, and political forces. His early stories, such as those in Dubliners, reflect his view of Dublin as a place of stagnation and limited possibility. Despite his desire to escape the constraints of Dublin, Joyce's works are infused with a deep sense of the city's geography, its people, and its culture. In many ways, Dublin became both a symbol of the limitations Joyce sought to escape and a source of profound inspiration for his writing. In the years following his departure from Ireland, Joyce's life became one of constant movement. He lived in various European cities, including Trieste, Zurich, and Paris, where he would work on his major literary projects. Despite the challenges of exile, Joyce thrived in these cities, where he was able to distance himself from the parochialism of Irish society and immerse himself in the intellectual currents of Europe. His years in Paris, where he became acquainted with leading modernist figures such as Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound, marked a turning point in his career. It was here that he began to work on Ulysses, a novel that would cement his reputation as one of the most innovative writers of the 20th century. During his time in Europe, Joyce developed a distinctive literary voice that reflected his complex relationship with his Irish roots and his desire to push the boundaries of literary form. His experiences as an expatriate shaped not only his worldview, but also his writing style. Joyce's ability to capture the intricacies of human consciousness and his groundbreaking use of language are directly tied to his experiences of dislocation and alienation. Through his exploration of the inner lives of his characters, Joyce created a literary world that was as complex and fragmented as the world he inhabited. James Joyce's formal education played a pivotal role in shaping his intellectual and artistic development. It was through his schooling in Dublin and later at University College Dublin that Joyce began to form the literary sensibilities that would define his work. Though his experiences were often marked by tension, especially in relation to the Catholic Church and the Irish nationalist movement, his education helped to provide him with the tools to craft his unique narrative voice. The institutions Joyce attended were not merely places of academic learning. They were sites where his developing views on art, religion, and Irish identity would crystallize. Joyce's first exposure to formal education occurred at Clongowes Wood College, a Jesuit boarding school located outside of Dublin. The institution was renowned for its academic rigor, and it offered Joyce the opportunity to delve into classical texts and languages. However, Joyce's time at Clongowes was not without its challenges. As a young boy, he struggled with his health, often suffering from eye problems that led to his eventual departure from the school. These early health issues would become a recurring theme throughout his life, reflecting a fragility that stood in stark contrast to the intellectual tenacity that would later define his literary work. Though Joyce's time at Clongowes was brief, the experience left an indelible mark on him, particularly in its focus on the Latin and Greek classics, which would become a cornerstone of his literary education. Following his departure from Clongowes, Joyce attended Belvedere College in Dublin, another prestigious Jesuit school. It was here that Joyce's intellectual abilities began to shine more clearly, and he became known as a gifted student, particularly in literature and languages. Belvedere, like Clongowes, was deeply rooted in Catholic tradition. It was at this school that Joyce's relationship with religion became increasingly complicated. Joyce was often critical of the religious instruction he received, feeling that the strict discipline and theological constraints imposed by the church stifled intellectual freedom. This conflict between his intellectual curiosity and the religious orthodoxy of the Jesuits would continue to surface in his writings, where themes of rebellion against religious dogma and the search for personal freedom would become central motifs. While Joyce's education at Belvedere was instrumental in nurturing his academic abilities, it also exposed him to the tensions that would define his view of Irish society. Joyce was acutely aware of the cultural and political currents shaping Ireland at the time. The rise of Irish nationalism and the desire for independence from British rule were inescapable forces. Yet Joyce was deeply skeptical of the nationalist movement. He saw it as a form of intellectual stagnation, one that sought to return to a glorified past rather than engage with the complexities of modernity. This view would be further developed during his time at University College Dublin, where Joyce's intellectual rebellion took on new dimensions. At University College Dublin, Joyce immersed himself in the study of modern languages and literature, focusing particularly on French literature and philosophy. His professors, many of whom were influenced by the intellectual currents of Europe, exposed him to new ideas that would shape his worldview. Among these influences were the works of French writers such as Charles Baudelaire, Paul Verlaine, and the symbolist poets whose emphasis on individual perception and artistic expression resonated with Joyce. The works of these writers would inspire Joyce's own experiments with language, narrative form, and the exploration of inner consciousness. It was here that Joyce began to develop his desire to break free from traditional narrative conventions, paving the way for the revolutionary writing that would define his career. In addition to French literature, Joyce was drawn to the works of European philosophers, particularly the German philosophers Friedrich Nietzsche and Immanuel Kant. Nietzsche's ideas on the will to power and the rejection of traditional moral values had a profound impact on Joyce's own artistic philosophy. Joyce admired Nietzsche's assertion of the individual's right to create meaning in an indifferent universe. This intellectual embrace of individualism and self-creation would later be reflected in Joyce's characters, who often struggle with questions of identity and personal freedom. Similarly, the philosophical concepts of Kant, particularly his theories on perception and the limits of knowledge, would influence Joyce's explorations of consciousness and the subjectivity of experience. Despite his growing intellectual sophistication, Joyce remained deeply critical of the educational and political structures around him. His growing disillusionment with Irish nationalism and the influence of the Catholic Church in public life led him to distance himself from both. Joyce's rejection of the religious orthodoxy that shaped much of Ireland's social and political life would become one of the defining characteristics of his work. His intellectual journey at University College was one of constant questioning, both of the institutions around him and of the limitations they imposed on individual thought. Joyce's commitment to intellectual independence, a rejection of easy answers, and a desire to engage with the complexities of modern life would serve as the foundation for his literary endeavors. In his years at University College, Joyce also began to write more seriously, experimenting with short stories and poetry. His early attempts at writing were often influenced by the literary traditions of the past, but Joyce was also determined to carve out his own path as a writer. He began to move away from the formal constraints of traditional narrative and poetry, seeking to create a new language of expression that could capture the complexities of human experience. His writings from this period reveal a preoccupation with themes of self-identity, personal freedom, and the search for meaning in a world that seemed both oppressive and indifferent. By the time Joyce completed his studies at University College Dublin, he had already begun to formulate the core ideas and themes that would define his literary career. He had become increasingly disillusioned with the narrow cultural and political vision of Ireland, and he had come to see literature as a means of expressing his own intellectual and artistic autonomy. Joyce's decision to leave Dublin and pursue a life of self-imposed exile in Europe was, in part, a direct result of his desire to break free from the intellectual and social constraints that he felt were imposed by his home country. His time at University College was a period of intense intellectual development, one in which he began to see himself as part of a larger European tradition of artistic and philosophical inquiry. After leaving Dublin in 1904, James Joyce embarked on a life of voluntary exile, a decision that would profoundly shape both his personal life and his literary career. Joyce's relocation to Europe, first to Paris and later to Trieste, Zurich, and eventually back to Paris, was driven by a combination of intellectual ambition, personal necessity, and a desire to escape the constraints of the Irish cultural and religious environment. As an expatriate, Joyce found a broader, more stimulating intellectual context that allowed him to flourish as a writer and begin to explore the new literary forms that would come to define modernism. Initially, Joyce moved to Paris, a city that was, at the time, a global hub for intellectuals, artists, and writers. The French capital offered Joyce the opportunity to immerse himself in the avant-garde currents of early 20th century modernism. He was in contact with a number of influential figures, including Gertrude Stein, a key figure in the literary avant-garde, and Ezra Pound, who would become a lifelong champion of Joyce's work. Paris, with its vibrant literary circles and its historical connection to the European avant-garde, was the perfect environment for Joyce to develop his ideas about language, literature, and the role of the artist in society. However, despite his involvement in these circles, Joyce remained intensely focused on his own work, often retreating from the bustling intellectual world around him to dedicate himself to writing. During his time in Paris, Joyce also began to experience the difficulties of being an expatriate. He struggled with financial instability, often relying on the support of friends and patrons, including Pound, who provided crucial encouragement and financial aid. Yet, despite these hardships, Joyce continued to write prolifically. It was in Paris that he began working on what would become his magnum opus, Ulysses, a novel that would challenge conventional ideas about narrative, character, and language. His years in Paris marked a period of intense creativity and intellectual development, as Joyce began to refine the radical, stylistic innovations that would define his later work. In 1905, Joyce moved to Trieste, Italy, a port city that offered a more stable environment for him to write and live. While in Trieste, Joyce continued to work on his early novels, and it was here that he began to develop the narrative and thematic elements that would later appear in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Trieste, though less cosmopolitan than Paris, provided Joyce with a quiet, relatively low-cost place to work, away from the distractions of larger European capitals. During this time, Joyce was able to focus intensely on his writing, working on a number of short stories and essays, while gradually developing the manuscript for his first novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Joyce's time in Trieste was also marked by personal upheaval. In 1904, he had met Nora Barnacle, a young Irish woman who would become his partner and the mother of his children. Joyce's relationship with Nora was deeply intertwined with his sense of self. as she played an essential role in both his personal life and his literary work. Their unconventional relationship, marked by both passion and conflict, served as a source of inspiration for much of Joyce's later work. Nora's influence can be seen most clearly in the character of Molly Bloom in Ulysses, whose soliloquy in the final chapter of the novel reflects Joyce's deep, often complex feelings toward his partner. Joyce's relationship with Nora, though tumultuous at times, was foundational to his emotional and creative life during these years. Despite the stability that Trieste offered, Joyce's life was still defined by a constant sense of exile. His ties to Dublin, both personal and literary, were never fully severed, and his experiences in Trieste were often colored by a longing for his home city. However, Joyce's distance from Ireland also allowed him to look at his native land with a critical eye. His feelings of alienation and frustration with Dublin's parochialism, as well as his skepticism toward the political and religious movements that dominated Irish society, began to emerge more clearly in his work. In Trieste, Joyce was able to develop the ideas that would later form the foundation of Ulysses, where the city of Dublin itself becomes not just a setting, but a living, breathing character that shapes the experiences of the novel's protagonists. In addition to his writing, Joyce's intellectual development during his years in Europe was marked by his engagement with the latest developments in philosophy, psychology, and literary theory. The works of Sigmund Freud, particularly his theories on the unconscious and the role of sexuality in shaping human behavior, had a profound impact on Joyce's writing. Freud's exploration of the complexities of the human psyche found an echo in Joyce's works, particularly in his portrayal of characters' inner lives. Joyce's ability to delve into the depths of consciousness, capturing the fragmented, often contradictory nature of human thought and emotion, was influenced by Freudian ideas, as well as by the stream of consciousness techniques employed by modernist writers. In the years following his move to Trieste, Joyce's writing took on an increasingly experimental quality. His short stories, collected in Dubliners, were marked by their stark realism and their focus on the theme of paralysis, the inability of individuals to break free from the constraints of their environment. However, as Joyce's literary ambitions grew, he moved toward more complex and ambitious forms of writing. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, his first novel, published in 1916, marked a significant departure from the realist style of Dubliners. It introduced readers to the character of Stephen Dedalus, a figure who would become central to Joyce's later works, particularly in Ulysses. A Portrait is a semi-autobiographical novel that explores the development of Stephen's artistic consciousness, offering a nuanced portrait of a young man's struggle to reconcile his intellectual ambitions with the constraints of his cultural and religious upbringing. Joyce's personal life during this period was also marked by the birth of his children, Giorgio and Lucia. While Joyce was dedicated to his work, he also faced the challenges of raising a family in difficult circumstances. His financial difficulties were a constant source of stress, and he was often forced to rely on the generosity of friends and patrons to support his family. However, despite these challenges, Joyce's relationship with Nora and his children remained central to his life. His family provided him with both the emotional support and the material assistance he needed to continue his writing, even as he faced numerous setbacks. James Joyce's literary career underwent a significant transformation with the creation of his first major novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, published in 1916. The novel was a deeply personal exploration of Joyce's own experiences growing up in Dublin, grappling with issues of identity, religion, and the quest for artistic freedom. It marked Joyce's departure from the realism of his earlier works, such as Dubliners, and his first major attempt to engage with modernist techniques. The novel's semi-autobiographical nature allowed Joyce to experiment with the narrative form while also engaging in a critique of the Irish society and its institutions, particularly the Catholic Church. Portrait follows the life of Stephen Dedalus, a character who, while closely based on Joyce himself, is not a direct representation of the author. The novel chronicles Stephen's journey from childhood to early adulthood, capturing his intellectual awakening, religious struggles, and ultimate desire to forge his own artistic path. Through Stephen's experiences, Joyce explores themes of self-discovery, the role of the artist in society, and the tension between individualism and social conformity. The novel serves as both a Bildungsroman and a manifesto for the artist, a work that illustrates the challenges and triumphs of the creative individual. The narrative style of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man was groundbreaking for its time. Joyce employed a stream of consciousness technique, allowing the reader to follow Stephen's inner thoughts and emotions in a fluid and often fragmented manner. This method of narrative allowed Joyce to capture the complexities of human consciousness, reflecting the way that thoughts, memories, and experiences interweave in the mind. By presenting the story from Stephen's point of view, Joyce gives the reader an intimate glimpse into his protagonist's psyche, making his internal conflicts and struggles all the more vivid. The novel begins with Stephen's earliest memories, focusing on his childhood experiences in Dublin. These early chapters are marked by a childlike simplicity in language, gradually becoming more complex as Stephen grows older. This shift in language mirrors Stephen's own intellectual and emotional development as he begins to question the world around him and assert his independence. Joyce's use of language in Portrait is often described as a reflection of Stephen's evolving understanding of the world, moving from the innocent, almost naive language of childhood to the more sophisticated and self-aware language of adolescence and adulthood. One of the central themes in A Portrait is Stephen's relationship with the Catholic Church, which plays a dominant role in Irish society. Joyce's own experiences with Catholicism were complex and ambivalent, and this is reflected in the novel's portrayal of Stephen's struggles with religious doctrine and authority. Stephen's religious journey is one of rebellion, as he moves from devout faith to skepticism and finally to a rejection of the Church's influence over his life. The novel's depiction of Stephen's spiritual conflict is not just a personal struggle. It also symbolizes the larger tension in Irish society between religious authority and the desire for intellectual and artistic freedom. Stephen's journey towards self-realization is also intertwined with his growing awareness of his role as an artist. Throughout Portrait, he is deeply concerned with the idea of the artist as a solitary figure, someone who must reject conventional societal expectations in order to create true art. Stephen's belief in the necessity of artistic freedom leads him to make a conscious decision to reject the social and religious norms that seek to constrain him. This decision is depicted as a painful but ultimately liberating one, as Stephen realizes that in order to be true to himself and his creative vision, he must distance himself from the constraints of his Irish heritage. The novel is also a meditation on the power and limitations of language. Joyce's use of language in Portrait is not merely a means of telling a story. It is an integral part of the novel's exploration of identity and self-expression. Stephen's increasing mastery of language reflects his growing sense of self, and his ability to articulate his inner thoughts is portrayed as a crucial step in his development as an artist. At the same time, the novel reveals the limitations of language, particularly when it comes to expressing the full complexity of human experience. This tension between the desire to communicate and the inadequacy of language to fully convey meaning is a recurring theme throughout Joyce's work. Another important aspect of Portrait is its critique of Irish nationalism, which Joyce viewed as narrow and parochial. While Ireland was in the midst of a nationalistic revival, Joyce was increasingly critical of the nationalist movement, which he believed was overly focused on traditional values and too steeped in religious dogma. Stephen's rejection of the nationalist rhetoric is evident throughout the novel, particularly in his conversations with friends and family members. His desire to break free from the confines of Irish identity and create a new artistic path for himself is, in many ways, a rejection of the nationalist agenda that dominated Irish culture at the time. The novel structure also reflects Stephen's intellectual and emotional growth. Each chapter of Portrait corresponds to a different stage in Stephen's life, beginning with his childhood and continuing through his adolescence and early adulthood. The progression of Stephen's development is mirrored in the changing narrative techniques employed by Joyce. As Stephen matures, The language becomes more sophisticated, and the stream of consciousness technique becomes more pronounced. The shift from a childlike perspective to a more complex, introspective one reflects Stephen's growing awareness of his identity and his place in the world. Portrait was not immediately recognized as a masterpiece upon its release, but it soon became clear that Joyce had created a work of lasting significance. The novel's innovative use of language, its exploration of the artist's struggle for independence, and its critique of Irish society and its institutions made it a groundbreaking work that would influence generations of writers to come. Joyce's decision to center the novel around a young man's journey of self-discovery was radical at the time, and the novel's introspective nature set it apart from the more traditional novels of the period. The publication of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man marked a pivotal moment in Joyce's career. It established him as one of the leading voices of modernism, and it laid the groundwork for the even more ambitious works that would follow, particularly Ulysses. In Portrait, Joyce's exploration of the complexities of human consciousness and his commitment to a new, more experimental form of writing were evident. The novel's success also marked the beginning of Joyce's recognition as a literary innovator, someone who was pushing the boundaries of narrative form and tackling profound questions about identity, religion, and the role of the artist in society. The composition of Ulysses represents the culmination of James Joyce's artistic evolution. Building on the foundations laid in his earlier works, particularly A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man in Dubliners, Ulysses would be Joyce's magnum opus, an ambitious novel that pushed the boundaries of literary form and narrative technique. Published in 1922, the novel is often hailed as one of the most important works of modernist literature, not only for its intricate structure and innovative use of language, but also for its audacious reimagining of the epic narrative. Joyce's decision to recast Homer's Odyssey in the context of a single day in Dublin in 1904 was nothing short of revolutionary. The novel is set on a single day, June 16, 1904, a date that would become forever associated with Joyce and his work due to its portrayal in Ulysses. The structure of the novel, mirroring the episodic nature of Homer's Odyssey, is divided into 18 episodes, each corresponding to a particular part of the classical epic. Joyce's decision to frame the novel within this ancient narrative structure, while updating it to the modern city of Dublin, allowed him to experiment with time, space, and character in ways that had never before been seen in literature. The comparison between the mythic and the everyday, the ancient and the modern, is a central theme in Ulysses, reflecting Joyce's belief that the mundane lives of ordinary people could be just as heroic and meaningful as the actions of mythic figures. The main character of Ulysses, Leopold Bloom, is a Jewish advertising agent in Dublin. His journey throughout the day, as he interacts with a wide array of characters and confronts personal challenges, mirrors the wanderings of Odysseus in Homer's epic. Bloom's experiences, his thoughts, memories, desires, and encounters are depicted in minute detail, with Joyce employing a stream of consciousness technique to provide readers with direct access to Bloom's inner world. This technique, though groundbreaking, was not the only aspect of the novel that challenged traditional narrative conventions. Joyce also employed a variety of other styles and forms throughout the text, from parodies of different genres of writing to experimental shifts in perspective, all of which serve to expand the possibilities of what a novel could be. One of the most striking features of Ulysses is its linguistic innovation. Joyce's use of language in the novel is both complex and playful. He constantly manipulates words, puns, and allusions to create layers of meaning that are often hidden beneath the surface of the text. This approach to language reflects Joyce's belief that language itself is a site of tension and struggle, where meaning is constantly shifting and evolving. Joyce's skillful use of the English language, combined with his exploration of its limitations, allows him to convey the complexities of human experience in a way that was entirely new. For example, the novel's famous stream of consciousness passages, especially in the chapters dedicated to Molly Bloom's soliloquy, break away from conventional grammar and punctuation, emphasizing the fragmented and nonlinear nature of thought. Joyce's treatment of time in Ulysses is another area where the novel stands apart from traditional narratives. By setting the story in a single day, Joyce confronts the conventional treatment of time in literature. Rather than following a linear progression of events, Ulysses weaves together multiple layers of time, memory, and perception. The characters' experiences are shaped not only by the events of the day, but also by their personal histories, dreams, and internal monologues. This fractured sense of time creates a rich, multidimensional narrative that reflects the complexity of human consciousness. Joyce's manipulation of time is also a reflection of his interest in the interplay between subjective experience and objective reality, a theme that would become central in much of modernist literature. In addition to its innovative narrative techniques, Ulysses also deals with profound philosophical and psychological themes. The novel is a meditation on the nature of identity, consciousness, and the self. The characters in Ulysses are not static figures, but complex, multifaceted individuals who are constantly evolving. Their internal thoughts and feelings are just as important, if not more so, than the external actions they perform. Joyce's exploration of the self is particularly evident in his depiction of Bloom, whose experiences as an outsider in Dublin, due to his Jewish heritage, are explored with sensitivity and depth. Through Bloom, Joyce examines issues of identity, alienation, and the search for belonging, themes that resonate on both a personal and a universal level. At the same time, Ulysses is also a critique of the societal and cultural norms of early 20th century Dublin. Joyce's portrayal of the city is both realistic and symbolic, capturing the particularities of Dublin life, while also using the city as a metaphor for the larger issues facing modern society. Dublin, as depicted in the novel, is a city of contradictions. It is a place of stagnation and paralysis, yet it is also a site of vibrant intellectual and cultural activity. Joyce's depiction of Dublin is filled with references to political and religious struggles, including the Irish nationalist movement and the influence of the Catholic Church. These elements serve to highlight the tension between individual desire and the forces of tradition and conformity that seek to suppress it. The character of Stephen Dedalus, who reappears from a portrait of the artist as a young man, also plays a crucial role in Ulysses. Stephen represents the intellectual and artistic ideals that Joyce held dear, yet he, too, is marked by a sense of alienation and dissatisfaction. Stephen's struggles with authority, both religious and societal, are explored in depth as he grapples with his role as an artist and his desire to forge his own path. Stephen's relationship with Bloom, which develops over the course of the novel, is also crucial to the thematic depth of Ulysses. The connection between the two men, both outsiders in their own ways, provides a counterpoint to the larger social and political forces at play in Dublin, offering a subtle meditation on friendship, mentorship, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. Upon its publication, Ulysses was met with both acclaim and controversy. Its radical narrative style, explicit content, and experimental form challenged the conventions of literature at the time, and the novel was initially banned in several countries. However, over time, its importance was increasingly recognized, and Ulysses became a landmark work in the modernist literary movement. The novel's influence can be seen in the work of countless writers who followed, including Samuel Beckett, Virginia Woolf, and William Faulkner, all of whom experimented with stream-of-consciousness techniques and fragmented narratives in their own works. Ulysses' exploration of the subjective nature of experience and its focus on the complexities of human consciousness were groundbreaking, setting a new standard for the possibilities of literary expression. After the immense success of Ulysses, James Joyce found himself in a position where he had become a central figure in the modernist literary movement. However, his life was far from straightforward. The following years marked a period of personal struggle, artistic ambition, and creative metamorphosis. In 1920, Joyce left his native Ireland, seeking to escape the stifling environment of his homeland, as well as to create the space for his literary voice to fully flourish. His exile took him to Paris, where he would remain for much of his later life, It was here that Joyce embarked on the most experimental and ambitious project of his career, Finnegan's Wake. While Ulysses had shattered literary conventions with its stream of consciousness narrative, fragmented time structure, and rich use of language, Finnegan's Wake would take these elements to new, almost unimaginable extremes. Whereas Ulysses had offered a reimagining of the Odyssey, Finnegan's Wake was a work of almost complete invention, one that defied the traditional boundaries of narrative, language, and even meaning itself. Finnegan's Wake was not just a novel, but an entire rethinking of the possibilities of literature. It was dense, cryptic, and elusive, filled with puns, allusions, and languages from across time and space. Unlike Joyce's earlier works, Finnegan's Wake was not easily accessible or immediately comprehensible. It demanded the reader's full engagement, presenting a text that required deciphering, interpretation, and patience. The writing of Finnegan's Wake was a process that spanned over many years. Joyce began working on a novel in 1923, and it was not completed until 1939, with its publication in 1939 marking the final phase of Joyce's literary career. The journey to bring Finnegan's Wake to fruition was a long and arduous one, with Joyce struggling both with his own health and with the intricacies of the novel itself. His eyesight had begun to fail, and he often relied on his wife, Nora Barnacle, and his daughter, Lucia, for assistance with his work. Despite these personal difficulties, Joyce's determination to complete Finnegan's Wake was unshakable, and the novel's complexity reflected the intensity of his focus and vision. One of the central features of Finnegan's Wake is its language, which is a peculiar and deliberately constructed amalgamation of English, Irish, French, Latin, and a host of other languages. Joyce created a new, fluid language, one that reflects the malleability and inconsistency of meaning. Words in Finnegan's Wake often take on multiple meanings, and entire sentences seem to bend and fold into one another, creating an ever-shifting narrative that reflects the cyclical nature of time and history. The novel's language is designed to be open-ended, allowing for an infinite number of interpretations and readings. This linguistic innovation was part of Joyce's larger project to break away from the conventional constraints of language and to explore its potential as a medium for expressing the subconscious, the dream state, and the depths of human experience. The content of Finnegan's Wake is as elusive as its language. The novel is often described as a dream narrative, where characters, symbols, and events shift in ways that defy conventional logic. It is a text of circularity, in which the end of the story loops back into the beginning, mirroring the cyclical nature of history itself. In the novel, the central characters, H.C., Humphrey Chimpden Earwicker, A.L.P., and Olivia Pluribel, and their children, are not clearly defined individuals, but rather archetypal figures who represent larger forces of history, culture, and the human psyche. The narrative moves in and out of various perspectives, blurring the line between characters and readers, and often merging multiple temporal and spatial layers into one. This sense of fluidity and transformation is central to the novel's themes, suggesting that history and identity are not fixed, but are instead constantly in flux. The cyclical structure of Finnegan's Wake is reflected in its central motif of the wake itself. The novel begins and ends with the same passage, symbolizing the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The idea of the wake is deeply embedded in Irish cultural traditions, particularly in the funeral rites, where the deceased are celebrated and remembered by the community. In Joyce's work, however, the wake is more than a ritual of mourning. It becomes a metaphor for the continuous process of transformation, both personal and historical. The novel's refusal to offer definitive conclusions or resolutions is a deliberate rejection of the linearity of traditional storytelling. Instead, Joyce offers a work that challenges readers to find their own meaning, to wrestle with the ambiguity, and to accept the impermanence and complexity of human experience. Another crucial aspect of Finnegan's Wake is its intertextuality. Joyce drew on a vast array of sources, from mythology and religion to philosophy and literature, and incorporated references to countless figures, events, and ideas. These allusions, many of them obscure or obscurely referenced, create a dense web of meaning that is integral to the novel structure. In Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's engagement with the past is not merely an exercise in literary reference, but an attempt to capture the totality of human experience and the interconnectedness of all things. The novel becomes a palimpsest of cultural history, a space in which time is both collapsed and expanded, where the past, present, and future coexist simultaneously. One of the most compelling aspects of Finnegan's Wake is the sense of the unconscious mind at play. The novel is often considered a study of the psyche, with its fragmented, dreamlike structure mirroring the disjointed and elusive nature of human consciousness. Joyce's own interest in psychoanalysis and the work of figures like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung influenced the ways in which he approached the subconscious in the novel. Finnegan's Wake is not just a novel about what is said, but about what is unsaid, what is hidden beneath the surface, and what lies within the recesses of the mind. The novel's obscurity, its difficulty, reflects the inherent complexity of the human experience and the impossibility of ever fully understanding the depths of our inner lives. Despite its difficulty and complexity, Finnegan's Wake has been hailed as one of the most important and influential works of the 20th century. Its radical approach to language and narrative has inspired generations of writers, scholars, and artists, and its impact on the world of literature is immeasurable. However, it remains a work that continues to challenge and perplex readers. For many, Finnegan's Wake is not simply a book to be read, but an experience to be undergone, a work that invites readers to participate in its creation of meaning, to become part of the cycle of interpretation and reinterpretation that the novel embodies. Joyce's final years were marked by health struggles and increasing isolation, as well as the growing recognition of his genius and the significance of his work. Finnegan's Wake, the pinnacle of his artistic achievement, encapsulated the full breadth of his intellectual and creative endeavors. It was, in many ways, the culmination of his lifelong exploration of language, identity, history, and the human condition. Even as Joyce's health deteriorated, his resolve to complete Finnegan's Wake remained unyielding. The novel's publication in 1939 was a moment of triumph, even as it signaled the end of Joyce's active career as a writer. As Joyce settled into life in Paris, his years of personal struggle, complex relationships, and mounting financial difficulties continued to shape his creative output. Though his literary career was at its zenith with Ulysses and the ongoing work on Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's life was far from serene. In Paris, he navigated the pressures of exile, health problems, and the challenges of raising a family, all while continuing to forge a path toward an artistic vision that seemed ever more distant from the conventional literary world. One of the most significant aspects of Joyce's time in Paris was his relationship with his family, particularly his wife, Nora Barnacle, and their children, Giorgio and Lucia. Nora, who had been Joyce's companion for many years, remained a steady source of support, despite the tumultuous nature of their relationship. Their bond had been a defining feature of Joyce's life, and Nora's role as his muse and confidant was critical during the periods when Joyce was deep in his creative process. She was, at times, his emotional anchor in the storm of his literary ambitions and personal struggles. However, the nature of their relationship was complex, with tensions often running high. Joyce's intense dedication to his work, particularly during the writing of Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, sometimes led to neglect of his family, and his health problems created further strain. Nora, for her part, was not an intellectual in the traditional sense, yet she possessed a deep understanding of Joyce's artistic vision. Her unwavering loyalty and practical sensibility often kept Joyce grounded, as she provided both emotional and financial support. However, Joyce's prolonged absences during his writing periods and his obsession with his work led to significant tensions. Joyce could be difficult to live with, especially as his health began to decline. His eyesight problems, which worsened over the years, also added to his struggles. It was during these years that Joyce became dependent on Nora and their daughter Lucia for help with his writing, as he could no longer physically manage the amount of work on his own. Joyce's relationship with his children was equally fraught, particularly with his daughter Lucia. Lucia Joyce, who had a turbulent life of her own, experienced significant mental health struggles, which became increasingly evident in her later years. Lucia's battle with mental illness, which Joyce often struggled to understand, added another layer of complexity to the Joyce family dynamic. In her youth, Lucia had shown artistic talent, and Joyce had hoped that she might follow in his intellectual footsteps. However, her mental health issues, which included periods of instability, were a source of immense pain for both Joyce and Nora. Lucia's problems worsened over time, and she was eventually institutionalized, a decision that deeply affected Joyce and haunted him throughout his life. Despite his professional success, Joyce's personal finances were precarious. He struggled with poverty throughout much of his adult life, even as his works were beginning to gain critical recognition. The publishing world was not always receptive to Joyce's unconventional works, and Ulysses, in particular, faced numerous legal battles due to its controversial content. These financial concerns, along with the ongoing political turmoil in Europe, compounded Joyce's stress during his years in Paris. He had to rely on the generosity of friends and patrons, such as Sylvia Beach, the owner of the famous Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris, who had published Ulysses in 1922, and the poet Ezra Pound, who had provided crucial support and encouragement for Joyce's work. The backdrop of political and cultural upheaval also played a role in shaping Joyce's life in Paris. The 1920s and 1930s were a time of significant change in Europe, marked by the aftermath of World War I, the rise of fascism, and the increasing instability of European politics. Paris itself was a city of contrasts. It was a hub for intellectual and artistic activity, yet also a place where the specter of war and revolution loomed large. Joyce, though not politically engaged in the traditional sense, was undoubtedly affected by the social and cultural changes occurring around him. His works, particularly Finnegan's Wake, can be seen as reflections of this broader historical context, even if they were not overtly political. The modernist project that Joyce was a part of was in itself a response to the disillusionment and fragmentation of the post-war world, and his works grappled with the complexities of the human condition in a time of crisis. At the same time, Joyce's personal health continued to decline, and he became increasingly frail. His struggles with his eyesight, a condition that had plagued him for years, worsened in the 1930s. He was constantly in pain and found it difficult to work at times, especially when the strain of reading and writing became too much. Despite these challenges, Joyce's determination to continue his literary work never wavered. His health issues did not slow him down in his drive to complete Finnegan's Wake, though they did make the process of writing even more difficult. He was often confined to a dimly lit room, dictating his work to Nora or Lucia, who would write down his words. Joyce's health also took a toll on his mental and emotional well-being. As the years wore on, his frustration with his physical limitations deepened. His inability to see his work clearly, both in the literal sense as his eyesight deteriorated and in the metaphorical sense as the scope of his literary ambitions expanded, left him feeling isolated and disconnected from the world around him. At times, he expressed a sense of helplessness about the state of his body and his inability to work at the pace he had once been capable of. Despite this, Joyce's commitment to his art remained unwavering. His obsession with Finnegan's Wake, in particular, became a means of both coping with and defying the decline of his body. The novel became a testament to his resilience and his refusal to accept conventional limits, whether in terms of language, narrative, or the demands of his own health. Though Joyce's time in Paris was marked by personal difficulty and struggle, it was also a period of profound creative accomplishment. Despite the challenges he faced, Joyce's output during this time remained prolific and visionary. Finnegan's Wake, as one of the most experimental and daring works in literary history, stands as a testament to his genius. Joyce's time in Paris, though not without its emotional and physical tolls, was also a period of great intellectual ferment. The city provided Joyce with a vibrant environment in which to work and interact with other influential artists, writers, and intellectuals. These connections, however strained or complex, contributed to his intellectual and creative growth. As the 1930s progressed, James Joyce's health issues became an ever-growing source of concern. His eyesight, which had been deteriorating for years, reached the point where it severely limited his ability to work. The once vibrant man who had left Ireland to pursue his writing now faced the grim reality of a body that seemed to be betraying him at every turn. Yet, despite the challenges of his failing health, Joyce's mind remained as sharp and inventive as ever. His physical suffering, however, was no longer just an obstacle in his life. It had become a constant companion, shadowing his every move and casting a long shadow over his family life and his work. The onset of Joyce's blindness, compounded by numerous other health issues, marked a turning point in his life. As he neared his late 40s and 50s, his vision began to deteriorate to the point where he could no longer read or write without assistance. Joyce had relied heavily on his eyesight to produce his groundbreaking works, often writing with great attention to detail. His struggles with visual impairment intensified his reliance on others, particularly his wife Nora and his daughter Lucia, who took on the task of transcribing his work as he dictated it. This collaboration with his family members became crucial in the production of his later work, especially Finnegan's Wake, which required not only immense creative energy, but also a practical collaboration that allowed Joyce to continue his work despite his increasingly limited physical capacity. While Joyce's health was a source of constant frustration, it was his emotional state that was perhaps even more troubling. The years of intense creative labor had taken a toll on his psyche. Writing a novel like Finnegan's Wake was an act of pushing boundaries, but it was also an emotionally and mentally exhausting endeavor. Joyce's work was becoming increasingly cerebral and complex, and the pressure of continually breaking new ground weighed heavily on him. In his final years, Joyce often expressed feelings of isolation and despair, as though the world had moved on without him. His thoughts frequently turned inward as he grappled with his limitations, both physical and intellectual. Throughout these years, Joyce's family became his most important support system. His wife Nora, who had been with him through thick and thin, remained by his side during his final battles. Nora, though not an intellectual like Joyce, had a deep understanding of his needs and provided practical care that allowed him to focus on his writing. The bond between them, though strained at times, had deepened over the years. Nora often described her life with Joyce as one of constant care, but also one of great love and devotion. Her emotional support, particularly in the face of Joyce's deteriorating health, was essential to the completion of Finnegan's Wake and to the overall stability of their household. Their daughter Lucia, however, presented a much more complex dynamic. Lucia Joyce's mental health problems had become increasingly severe over time, and her relationship with her father was marked by tension and frustration. Joyce had hoped that Lucia would follow in his intellectual footsteps, but her struggles with mental illness made it difficult for her to fulfill this role. Lucia's condition led to her eventual hospitalization, a tragic outcome for both Joyce and Nora. This emotional burden, coupled with the ongoing stresses of his own health, only intensified the sense of isolation that Joyce often felt. In addition to the familial challenges, Joyce's financial situation remained precarious throughout his life. Despite the success of Ulysses and the growing recognition of his literary genius, he struggled with money until the end. Much of his life had been spent in relative poverty, relying on the support of patrons, friends, and even the goodwill of publishers who believed in his work. Sylvia Beach, who had famously published Ulysses through her Shakespeare and Company bookstore, continued to offer her support, but the financial strain was relentless. Joyce's financial troubles, along with his ongoing health struggles, contributed to a sense of urgency in his creative output. He had to finish Finnegan's Wake not only for artistic reasons, but also to secure his legacy and ensure that his family was provided for in the event of his death. Despite these difficulties, Joyce remained remarkably dedicated to his writing. In his final years, his focus was almost entirely on completing Finnegan's Wake, a work that had consumed him for nearly 2 decades. Though he could no longer physically see his work, his mind remained as sharp as ever, and he dictated the text to those around him, carefully guiding them through the dense layers of meaning he had built into the novel. His health continued to decline, but his will to complete the project remained unshaken. As his body became weaker, his determination to finish Finnegan's Wake became a defining feature of his final years. It was clear that this was to be his magnum opus, the culmination of his life's work. Finally, in 1939, Joyce's labor came to an end with the publication of Finnegan's Wake. The novel, which had been an act of defiance against traditional narrative and language, was completed despite all the odds. Joyce had given birth to a masterpiece, one that would forever alter the landscape of literature. Yet, this triumph came at a steep cost. Joyce was not able to see the full extent of the impact his work would have, as his health continued to decline, and his final years were marked by increasing physical fragility. He had completed his masterpiece, but his body was failing him, and his future seemed uncertain. Joyce's final years were marked by increasing suffering. His health continued to deteriorate rapidly, and he was forced to contend with numerous complications, including a perforated ulcer. The disease that had slowly crippled him over the years was now reaching its final stages. On January 13, 1941, Joyce passed away in Zurich at the age of 58. His death marked the end of a tumultuous, groundbreaking career, but his legacy as one of the most innovative and influential writers of the 20th century was secured. Joyce had reshaped the boundaries of literature, and his work would continue to inspire and challenge readers and scholars for generations to come. Despite his relatively early death, Joyce's influence on the literary world was profound. The legacy of Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, and his other works ensured that his place in the literary canon was firmly established. Joyce's impact on the development of modernism and his radical approach to language, narrative, and form left an indelible mark on the world of literature. His writing was not only a reflection of his time, but also a projection of the future of the novel as an art form. Joyce's commitment to pushing the boundaries of language and form reshaped the way we understand narrative and the relationship between the reader and the text. In the years following his death, Joyce's works continued to inspire critical analysis, debate, and reinterpretation. Ulysses, in particular, became a cornerstone of modernist literature, and its influence can be seen in the works of writers such as Samuel Beckett, Thomas Pynchon, and Virginia Woolf. Finnegan's Wake, though often considered impenetrable, remains a touchstone for literary experimentation, its complexity and ambiguity continuing to provoke scholars and readers alike. James Joyce's life and work have become a testament to the power of language and the resilience of the human spirit. His ability to push the limits of what literature could achieve, even in the face of enormous personal adversity, solidified his place as one of the most significant figures in literary history. Though his life was filled with personal struggles, his contribution to the world of literature is immeasurable, and his legacy endures as a beacon for future generations of writers, thinkers, and readers. James Joyce's death in 1941 marked the conclusion of an extraordinary and tumultuous life, but the impact of his work reverberates to this day. Though he passed at a relatively young age, his contributions to literature have had a lasting and transformative effect on the landscape of modern writing. Joyce, through his bold experimentation with narrative structures, his profound insights into the human psyche, and his revolutionary approach to language, continues to shape the trajectory of literature, often pushing the boundaries of what a text can be and how readers engage with it. Ulysses, arguably his most famous and most accessible work, is frequently cited as one of the greatest novels ever written. Published in 1922, it immediately marked a radical departure from traditional narrative forms, offering a stream of consciousness exploration of the everyday experiences of its characters. The novel's combination of intricate, intellectual layers with deeply human concerns, such as love, identity, and the search for meaning ensures its continued relevance. Its bold experimentation with language, form, and structure disrupted conventional notions of the novel, establishing Joyce as a trailblazer in the modernist movement. The work's depiction of a single day in the life of Leopold Bloom, set against the backdrop of Dublin, remains a powerful testament to the scope and depth that a narrative can achieve when freed from traditional constraints. Though Ulysses remains Joyce's most widely read and celebrated work, his final novel, Finnegan's Wake, stands as the most enigmatic and challenging. Published in 1939, Finnegan's Wake took Joyce's exploration of language to its extreme. Written in a dense, multi-layered prose that incorporates languages from across the globe, mythological references, puns, and neologisms, the novel became an almost impenetrable text for many readers. Despite its difficulty, Finnegan's Wake has become an object of intense, scholarly interest and admiration. Its challenge is not only intellectual, but also philosophical. What does it mean to read, to understand, and to interpret? In some ways, Finnegan's Wake can be seen as a critique of conventional literacy itself, asking the reader to engage with the text on an almost primal level, to uncover meaning not just through reason, but through intuition and sound. Beyond the texts themselves, Joyce's influence permeates the entire field of literary criticism. The radical nature of his work, especially in its breaking with linear narrative and embracing multiple, often contradictory perspectives, helped to shape the postmodern literary movement. Writers like Samuel Beckett, who was both a friend and a collaborator with Joyce, absorbed much of his mentor's ideas about language, time, and narrative. Beckett's Waiting for Godot and his other works reflect Joyce's influence, especially in their sparse, fragmented style, their focus on the absurdity of existence, and their defiance of traditional literary forms. Joyce's approach to language, his determination to stretch and reshape it, to make it an instrument capable of capturing the deepest reaches of consciousness, would also echo through the works of later writers like Thomas Pynchon, William Gaddis, and Don DeLillo. Joyce's innovation in terms of language and form wasn't confined to his fiction alone. His use of stream of consciousness, for example, helped to open up new ways of representing thought, memory, and perception on the page. Modernist writers, especially in the early 20th century, were obsessed with capturing the inner workings of the human mind, and Joyce's narrative style allowed for an unprecedented exploration of consciousness. With Ulysses, Joyce presented an intricate mosaic of thoughts, fragmented recollections, and continuous inner monologues. This technique offered readers a direct encounter with the subjective experiences of the characters, which was an entirely new approach to storytelling. His influence can be traced in the works of later experimental authors who sought to reflect human consciousness in all its complexity, without simplifying or smoothing out its inherent contradictions. One of Joyce's most enduring legacies is his reshaping of the relationship between the writer and the reader. In many ways, Joyce's work is a conversation between the author and the reader, a conversation that requires effort, patience, and engagement. Whereas many novels of the time sought to entertain or deliver a clear message, Joyce's work demands a more active role from the reader, requiring them to piece together meaning from fragmented images, words, and cultural references. In this way, Joyce's literature reflects the fragmented nature of modern existence itself, a world where traditional meanings no longer hold, and where each individual must navigate the chaos and confusion of a constantly shifting reality. Additionally, Joyce's attention to the minutiae of life has made his work an invaluable resource for scholars of both literature and cultural history. His detailed portrayals of Dublin and Ulysses have transformed the city into a literary landmark, so much so that the novel has become inextricably linked to the geography and culture of the Irish capital. Joyce's Dublin was not simply the backdrop for his characters, but was a vital part of their psychological and social lives. This deep connection between place and identity in Joyce's work has influenced countless writers who seek to capture the essence of a specific location. Whether it's the streets of Paris in the works of James Baldwin or the urban landscape of New York in the novels of Don DeLillo, Joyce's literary achievements have also made him a central figure in discussions about the modernist project. His works, particularly Ulysses, embody the modernist desire to push literature beyond the boundaries of the past, breaking away from realism and traditional forms in search of a new artistic expression. Modernism, with its rejection of linear narrative, its exploration of fragmented identities, and its focus on the inner workings of the mind, found one of its greatest champions in Joyce. Through his work, Joyce challenged the ways in which literature could represent time, consciousness, and reality, and his influence can be seen not only in literature, but in other art forms, such as film and theater. In addition to his impact on the arts, Joyce's legacy has extended to the realm of academia. His works have become subjects of intense study, and there is scarcely a university or institution of higher learning that does not have scholars dedicated to understanding his life and writings. Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, and Joyce's other works have spurred entire academic disciplines, with scholars constantly revisiting and reinterpreting his texts, seeking new meanings and insights. His work is continuously explored through lenses such as psychoanalysis, post-colonialism, structuralism, and deconstruction, illustrating the versatility and richness of Joyce's vision. Moreover, Joyce's work has inspired an entire industry of books, essays, lectures, and critical journals, all dedicated to unpacking the layers of his novels. His texts have become a benchmark for writers and critics seeking to explore the limits of language and narrative form. Indeed, Joyce's influence extends beyond just his own literary output, as his work has helped to define the field of modernist literature and has paved the way for generations of writers to experiment with new styles, structures, and ways of seeing the world. In the decades following his death, Joyce's place in the literary canon has only grown stronger. His work continues to be read, studied, and admired, both by scholars and by a broader public. Ulysses, once considered controversial and difficult, has come to be regarded as a masterpiece and is widely taught in university literature programs. Finnegan's Wake, though still challenging, is increasingly understood as a key text in the modernist tradition, its complexity now seen as a vital part of its beauty and importance. Joyce's literary daring, his devotion to pushing the boundaries of form and content, and his unyielding commitment to his artistic vision continue to inspire writers, thinkers, and readers today. Ultimately, the legacy of James Joyce is one of artistic audacity, intellectual rigor, and an unflinching exploration of the human experience. Through his work, Joyce forever changed the way we approach literature. He taught us that the boundaries of language and narrative are not fixed, but are, in fact, meant to be challenged and expanded. His ability to create art out of the most intimate and everyday experiences has ensured that his work remains relevant and resonant, a mirror to the complexities of life itself. The world of literature will forever be indebted to James Joyce for his unparalleled contribution to the modernist movement and for the indelible mark he left on the history of writing.